Okay, welcome to our roundtable with our reenactors. We've been doing a lot of the history stuff for this week, so these are the people that we invite to come and do a good job portraying the different kinds of people that are part of our theme this year. So we thought maybe we'd just do a little bit of talk about them. I'll also give you an opportunity if you have any questions about them or you're considering this as a hobby. We're going to give you the kind of the inside scoop here. So starting way down on the other side is our native, which is Greg Rerick. Greg has been helping us for a number of years with the organizational part of it. Next to him is the Tin Man, they call him, Roy Phillips. And he's got the nice display here. Our blacksmith is Dennis Murray, and he's in the middle here. And he's been up there around the forge all day. It's been warm enough, and then you do that all the time anyway. So, and then one of our board members again is Jim Brown, and Jim's I think you're your last Brit that we have left here, I think, today. The last of the Brits. Okay. So, what I would like to kind of do is we're going to pass the mic around there a little bit. Let's start off with each one of you. How you guys gotten started? Why do you do this?
I got interested in history, I guess, first in 4th grade. I'm from Armstrong County, Pennsylvania. The county seat is Kittanning, and in the 1720s through the 1750s, Kittanning was the largest Delaware Indian village in Pennsylvania. And when I was in 4th grade, our teacher read from the history of Armstrong County the account of General Armstrong taking 307 soldiers, militiamen, on a 125-mile trek across central Pennsylvania through Indian-held territory to attack and burn the village of Kittanning. At the same time during my life, my father was a surface hunter. He would go out in the plowed fields after a rain and look for Indian artifacts. We were rather confused back at that time. We assumed those arrowheads that we were finding had to be from the Delaware who lived in Kittanning. And then folks from the Smithsonian showed up at my dad's house and looked at his collection and said, oh, no, those arrowheads aren't 300 years old or 200 years old. Those arrowheads are anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 years old. That's how long the natives have been in this area and even longer. So I've always been interested in history. I enjoy reading about it. At one stage in my life, I wasn't getting along real well with my wife, and I decided that going to these reenactments as a tourist was one way to get away with my son and not have to deal with my ex-wife. So it was a strange way to start a hobby. But we would go to events as tourists, and at first, as a 6 or 7 year old, my son would want to run to Sutler's Row and buy one of those toy guns or a sword or something like that. And he looked at everything in all the camps and all these displays. But over the years, as we continued to attend as tourists, he didn't want to see any of that. He wanted to, where are the natives? Where are the natives, Dad? I want to go see the natives. So we would make a beeline through the encampment to go see the natives. And I was just amazed that my son remembered the names of all these reenactors who were portraying natives. Oh, there's Scattered Leaves and Many Faces and Little Wolf. We saw them at such and such an event. And one year we took them over to Fort Roberdeau, which is a Revolutionary War fort over east of Altoona. And en route to the fort, I explained to my son the purpose of Fort Roberdeau. There were lead deposits in the mountains in that area. The British had blockaded our ports. We had no access for lead to return fire of the Brits during the Revolutionary War. So Dr. Roberdeau funded building of the fort, sending miners out to dig the ore and set up a smelter there to turn the ore into lead. And we arrived at Fort Roberdeau. We go in the fort. We're talking to people. It starts to rain. We end up in one of the cabins. And who's there? The natives. And my son starts talking to them, and they said, well, you're just this dumb little white boy. You don't know anything about history. And my 7-year-old son was able to relate the story about Fort Roberdeau that I just told you, and these guys' jaws dropped to the floor. Here's a 7-year-old that knows this kind of history. And throughout all those visits, I kept asking my son, well, would you like to try this as a hobby? You like to camp, you like to cook, eat food cooked on a fire. Don't you think you'd like to do this as a hobby? And after 2 or 3 more events and him, oh, there's scattered leaves, there's many faces, these are my friends. Well, then he decided, yeah, Dad, we're going to do this as a hobby, but we have to be natives, which I was overwhelmed and very grateful, because if you look at what I'm wearing, this isn't a very expensive costume. I've got a shirt, I've got a breechcloth, and I've got leggings. I didn't have to spend $1,000 to get in the hobby to buy a uniform. And I felt, well, if we camped out 1 or 2 times and my son didn't like it, what am I out of? The price of a shirt and some wool. But it ended up he enjoyed the hobby, and he stuck around with me till he was 17 and discovered cars and girls, and that became way more important than reenacting. And by that time, these people had basically become family. One of the reenactors says, coming to these events is like going to a family reunion. You just don't know which of your crazy cousins are going to be there this time. So that's why I do it. I enjoy talking about history, sharing knowledge about history, and it's a fun hobby. And there's nothing better than burning up a couple pounds of powder every weekend.
Oh boy. Roy Phillips. Okay, I'm from Somerset area. I've lived there for over 40 years. I sort of came late into this hobby because I'm a retired computer science teacher. So I've regressed in time, you might say, tremendously back into the 1700s. I retired when I was 60 and went out to our historical center in Somerset and told Mark Ware, I says, I'll do anything as long as it doesn't relate to computers, because I've been in computers since 1960, so I've been through the whole gauntlet. Okay, so I helped him work doing coopering with Fred Will, and I helped teach the coopering classes, which I really enjoyed coopering. It was a lot of fun. And in the meantime, a friend of mine, Terry Tallien, was a French soldier, French Marine de Canticourt. We took us to, my wife and I, to Fort Frederick, which you probably heard of, and we ended up buying some reenactor clothing. And we came back, and I'm still doing some coopering, and then they needed help doing some blacksmithing. So I said, okay, I'll do some blacksmithing. And I kind of like that too, but I'm not near what this gentleman here will tell you about. And he's got a lot more stories than I do. But anyhow, I went and did some blacksmithing and did school tours for a couple of years. And I said, well, so we have the masters there. I said, what don't you? And he said, we don't have a tinsmith. And I said, well, what do they do? Okay. So he got me grant money to study under our master tinsmith, Greg Petersma, south of Ottawa, Canada. So I took my truck camper and went up to Canada and camped on his property for the summer, and he taught me everything he could about tinsmithing. First thing in tinsmithing, I'm left-handed. My wife's left-handed. You have to cut tin with your right hand, and was not very ambidextrous, you might say. Okay, so I had the first thing I had to do, cut circles. If you're left-handed and you try to cut circles with your right hand, it takes you a while to get onto it. But I can cut a pretty mean circle now. It took me a while to get to that point. But he ended up teaching me on tools from the 1700s called swedges. I've used all of them. I started out with, it's all manual tooling. And I came back to Somerset. I had no tools at all. But I had a good friend, George Bowser, that was a retired teacher like myself, but he'd have taught me the metalworking end of it, but at that point he was in his 90s, and that's why I went the other route, went to Greg Petersma. But he was a collector, thank goodness for me. So I went down to his place, and he had just about everything I needed, okay? So I collected it all from him, and he said he'd sell it to me as long as it was going to stay in Somerset County. I said, good, I can do that, because that's what my intention was in the first place. So I got all the tooling, came back, and sort of been playing with the tin world ever since. Each year I go to a tinsmith convergence. It's where all the good name, Bill McMillan, I mean, I can name them down the road, the really top tinsmiths in the country get together, and we roundtable like this. So we talk about all the tin. We talk about the working the metal. We're talking about patterns. Like we got a pattern from out east in Ohio that was also thought to be down in Fort Ligonier for a canteen. It's Fort Meigs. So we kind of think that it's gone to both places, but we haven't been able to prove it yet. But we do share patterns and things that you come up with that people use, and that's what we try to create. I try to, someone will bring me something, some old artifact, and say, can you recreate this? And I said, okay. If I think it's worthwhile and it's actually an original, I'll recreate it. And I always give those folks one of them for doing it, and I've got a pattern, because you have to develop a pattern in tinning to do anything. But I sort of regressed in time, and I'm loving every minute of it. My wife now, after I got her to retire, okay, she's doing it with me also. We're doing it full time, and we travel around. Oh my gosh, like you, I mean, all kinds of events. And they have to be historical. I don't do craft shows. I want to do where people are interested in history. Okay, I mean, that's my big thing. It's going out and showing them, yeah, this is what was used, and you can still use it today, especially if you come in rain, no electricity. Tinning lanterns work pretty good. Okay, so that's where I'm at right now. I've been into it now since 2004. Okay, so for a while. Now, Dennis?
Thank you.
Give us some enjoyment.
Oh, well, let's see. Well, how I got started in it was quite a bump ago, but I always loved history as well. But the school I went to, the history teachers, they were more interested in coaching basketball and football. And when it come to history, well, I talk about ambition. Them boys, if it wasn't for gravity, I don't think their bowels would move. They were quite the boys. But I always loved history. And then I got into blacksmithing. I always wanted to go deer hunting, but Dad wouldn't let me have a gun until I was 16. Well, at the ripe old age of 11, he did get me a piece of railroad rail, and I got a bag of charcoal, and I dug a hole in the hillside, and then I slapped up a little forge. But I borrowed my mother's electric, what do you call that, Electrolux, and I used the exhaust off of it, and I promptly burnt the end off the sweeper, and that didn't go over real well. But anyways, I just kept collecting tools pretty much like Roy did over the years, and by the time I was in my 20s, I had a sort of a, what do you call it, some simplistic shop out under an apple tree. And of course, when it rained, that shut everything down, and I had devil of a time with that. But eventually, I went and learned how to hew logs, and we put up a stone foundation, and we slapped up a whole 17 by 21 shop, and we put about a 4-ton forge in there made out of cut stone. And away we went with that. Well, then, see, I was a piece of industrial waste. I worked as a lab technician and an analyst for Quaker State Refining. And in 1980, they decided to close the refinery where I had my employ. And so I decided to go to college at the ripe old age of 35. When I got out, I got a degree in chemistry and chemistry, physics, and science, and I got a job up at a place called St. Mary's PA, and for the next 30 years, that's where I went. Well, a guy that was beside me got me into coaching track, and we'd stand around killing time, and we got into Indian lore, like the natives, we like that. And then I started to think about legends and stories about stars and constellations, and I come up with this little fellow. His name was Broken Stick. And Broken Stick, when he started out, why, his father, anything he saw when he stepped out of the lodge house, first thing he saw when he was going to name his child, why, that would be it. And there were, kids like Heavy Eagle and Jumping Bear and all this stuff. Well, he stepped on a twig and it broke, and he called his son Broken Stick. We was sort of the brunt of a lot of jokes, and his peers would make fun of him and stuff like that. And Broken Stick, finally, when he hit puberty, you'd go out in the woods and you'd fast, and you'd have a vision, and then that would be your adult name. Now you could be, Fighting Beaver, all these cool names. Well, he's out there, he's emaciated, he's fasted for 4 days, he's by his fire pit, and he began to stone boil. He was allowed to have a weak tea, and he gathered some hemlock boughs and put that in there, and he picked up hot stones from the fire and put it in a little clay pot with water and started to boil it. Well, I'll be doggone, here comes this turtle coming along in front of him, and all of a sudden, the little fellow stood up on his hind legs and spread his little front paws out and began to speak to Broken Stick. And he said, this is a quintessence. This is the moment I get my name. And all of a sudden, the turtle lost his footing and fell into the boiling water. He got killed. Oh, he was brokenhearted. He was about as down in the mouth as you can come. And he said he just went into a sort of a catatonic state. And here over time, why that meat inside that turtle shell shuffled down into that pot, and the stones, because of a coefficient of expansion, why they would move around, and they ground that meat up into a fine powder and got to the bottom of the pot. Now, a little backpedaling. English gentry that had the financial wherewithal to go to the Americas, and they'd shoot big game. It was a wonderful thing to have a black bear, or you name the, forest bison, etc., have a taxidermist prepare it, and it would be at your estate for display and, bragging rights. Here comes this fella coming through the woods with all his regalia, and he sees this little poor emaciated Indian there, and he saw it, and he went down, and he sniffed his pot, and he thought, this fella's about half starved, but smells like he got something here pretty good in that pot. So he added more water, and he knew how the stone boil, and boy, he tasted pretty good. He got the little fella back to health. And that fella, that Englishman, that Colonel Lipton, got to making powdered soups after that, and he made himself a fortune. It's amazing how things come about like that. And that's the first story I ever made up while I was coaching track. And then after that, I got to making bigger and bigger stories and listening to Jerry Clowers and reading books, and I got into storytelling that way. More back to blacksmithing, why I got a portable forge. In fact, the one I'm using now, we just built one for Muller's book, which has a bellows, which needs rebuilt. And I've been on the road ever since hocus pocus. 1985, I think, we started hitting the road and doing little shows and stuff like that. And I did school programs, et cetera, and away we went. And I got into storytelling, and so that sort of augments while you're standing around just pounding iron. Why, it's nice to take a break, and I take a lot of them. And I tell a story now and then. I did Civil War for 30 years, and now I'm going retrograde. I'm going further back in history. So I like that. Now, I have a wonderful wife, Judy, back there. She's my seamstress. She makes all my clothes for me. So I got to give her some accolades there. So that's how I got rattled into this mess. So here we are.
My name's Jim Brown. I was born in Warren, Pennsylvania, and pretty much lived in northwestern Pennsylvania most of my life. And I got into reenacting because I've always had a love of history. And in fact, when I was a youngster growing up, I loved reading history books, and I was pretty well read in the Civil War. That was my main focus of history, so my mother was surprised when I decided to go colonial history. But what changed my focus of interest in the period of time in history was I read a book by Alan W. Eckert, and I can't believe it. It was either the Frontiersman or Wilderness Empire. I can't remember exactly which book, but it talked about history and happened in this area, and so that's basically how I got interested in the colonial history. And then around 97, I decided I needed a hobby, and I remember I used to go over to Heritage Days and watch the reenactments over there they'd have up at the fairground, and I always thought to myself that'd be an interesting hobby to get into. And so then 97, I joined Dumas Company out of Pittsburgh, and also 8th Pennsylvania was in this area at the time. And I did a French soldier and also colonial soldier, 8th Pennsylvania. And now I'm dressed as a British soldier. I did French soldier for 20-some years, but I decided to kind of mix it up a bit and investigate some other interpretations, historical interpretations. So I'm dressed as a 60th Royal American, which would have been garrisoned the Fort Venango, located over in Franklin. And that was after the French and Indian War. The British won the war, and this all became British territory, and they rebuilt the forts the French had burned when they left. So yeah, I've been everywhere from Williamsburg to Louisburg, Nova Scotia. That's the furthest I ever traveled for a reenactment. And that was a port in French naval base during the French and Indian War, because it sits up near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, and it's they need a harbor that was ice-free during the winter. But the French built a fortress there to protect the ship traffic coming in and out of Canada, so that was an important base for them. And yeah, I've been doing this hobby for 23, 24 years now. I kind of lost count, but it's a nice hobby. If you like going to historical sites, you usually get free lodging. You get to camp in the historical buildings, and so get to go different places and meet different people, and so that makes it interesting there. So and maybe later I'll talk about some equipment I have here, but I'll let Mark take over now.
Okay. Back to Roy there. Typically, how many weekends, or when does the season start? When does it end? A little bit about your travel schedule. I know you've got a bunch of stuff to haul and pack and stuff like that. Give us a little insight in what it's like being on the road in the 18th century.
Yeah, well, it's really great. I mean, meanwhile, back at the ranch, Marine de Conticourt, we were the French outfit I alluded to a little bit before. He just reminded me as a Brit. I like to go out and shoot Brits, okay, as a Marine de Conticourt. And I've been to a lot of Nova Scotia. I've been to all the 250th, which were really great historical events. And the really good part is, you're right, we get to stay in these forts, okay, and we get to learn a lot of history. And there are ghosts in Fort Niagara, okay? If you're staying in that fort, I know folks that won't even stay inside the fort for what they say. The soldiers are still there. But we travel around, this year, 17 weekends out of the summer. We start at Fort Frederick, and we go from there. We go to like Fort Robideau. We were not there this weekend because we're here, all right? We were at Washington's Whiskey Rebellion last weekend. We'll be out in New Boston, Ohio. Then we're going back to Fort Niagara the end of this month for the War of 1812. Okay, and then we just keep going on there into October. Last event is like towards the end of October, and that's an iron furnace. We go to some small events, small like this, small historical events that are worthwhile, okay, to bring forward the artifacts, the tinware that we make. It's just like Dennis and all the hardware that he makes, okay, for folks, and especially young people, to see them. When I talking to the audience, so to speak, I mean, most folks here are up in pretty good age, okay, not old at all, but I talk to kids. I don't talk to parents for the most part, because I want the kids to gather the history. Okay, which is really nice. And I make things for kids and give it to them so they can remember. I give a lot of, we give a lot of stuff away that we don't even sell, because, you know, that's what it's all about. If I leave a little memory to that child, a little bit of history that he's going to take forward and make him interested in these time periods, which our history books in school, they've kind of let the ball go as far as following history. I used to go into schools in Somerset County as a French soldier with all my accoutrements, everything you see that Jim has here, okay, that you have, okay, his muskets, knives, axes, everything. You used to be able to take those into school. It was kind of neat. All right, I mean, we only had one shot, so it was kind of worthless for us to be there. But it gave a good history point. And one thing I found, especially during the F&I period, every time almost at every class that I was teaching to, at the end of the class, they'd say, well, who won the war? For the French and Indian War. I said, well, what language do you speak? Things like that they need to know. Okay, so when parents bring them out to these events, I think it's really great. But we do have quite a few events, and we're asked to go to a lot of events that I feel aren't historically necessary, so I don't go there. I go to like this, like we're right here. It's Crockerton. It makes sense. Okay, and we teach kids. Okay.
direct my attention to Greg there. I know there's other groups, and we've talked about this before, that these belong to organizations where the natives are kind of their own freewheeling group. They don't normally clan together. We always talk about herding cats, all right? So maybe that's a good phrase. So being a native, and there are so many different ones out there, and we had quite a few here. Talk a little bit about being native and the things that you do that you end up connecting with other people with.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to be honest with you. I have absolutely no Native American blood. I am Scotch, Irish, and German. And so whenever I do programming and whenever I talk to the public, if there are people who have questions about native family genealogy, spirituality, and things like that, I attempt to steer them to people who have native background, who have native blood in their genealogy, because I have not studied that aspect of Native American life. I don't want to mislead these people and give them a false information. I try to limit what I talk about, the things that I deal with at the various sites, to the knowledge that I know. And I attempt to portray what the tribe themselves called the Lenape or Lenape, what the Europeans, the English, called them Delaware. And the reason why I chose Delaware, again, was my connection with Armstrong County and the village of Katanning that was attacked and burned. Unlike many of the natives, I do belong to organized units, but I'm more or less the token native in several of them. The company LaBeouf, which is one of the units that I belong to, has a quite healthy Native American contingent. I think there's 10 or 15 Native American people playing or portraying Native Americans, not necessarily having Native American blood, but doing like me, attempting to present what those people were like, what their beliefs or needs were, how they were feeling in regards to the advancement of the Europeans into what had been their traditional lands, the different interactions between the Delaware tribe and the Iroquois Confederacy and the English. And basically, the Delaware tribe were a very peaceful and easygoing tribe. They were first exposed to Europeans when the Dutch and the Swedes were in possession of what became Pennsylvania. And then they interacted with William Penn whenever he was granted the lands of Pennsylvania by the English government. And Penn treated them very well, and they liked Penn. The name that the Indians chose to call Penn was Onus, which is the Delaware word for quill, so Quill Penn. They assumed name the pen, oh, that was the thing you wrote with. So he became Onus, and they were good friends with Onus. The big trouble came after Onus passed away, and his sons, who were a little more greedy than William Penn, decided that he could sell all these lands off that the Indians were on because they were merely Indians. They weren't white people. They didn't count for anything in the British eyes. The only thing a Native American was utilized for by the English in particular was somebody in order to get furs from and sell trade goods to. The French, on the other hand, were not interested in taking possession of the land. They were there to deal and to trade and to possibly even intermarry and become members and related to the Native Americans. But as far as units go, ever since the events of 9/11, it has become very difficult for reenactors who are not members of a unit to be allowed to go on a site. It's getting to the point where we're required to have liability insurance. I don't know why. I mean, we're carrying knives, we're carrying tomahawks and clubs, we're carrying, I don't know why anybody would need liability insurance when they've got all this stuff in their campground and you have curious little kids' fingers reaching for it. But they're becoming more and more organized. There are several units out here now that are almost strictly Native American, but most units don't have the opportunity to limit the personas of the people who are in there. The hobbies participants are getting older. We're having difficulty getting young people to come and join us in the hobby, and once they do join, as I said about my son, they learn about girls and cars, and history is no longer important. But there are quite a few units, and if you are interested in joining the program, becoming a reenactor, why, feel free to talk to the people here, and we'll try to hook you up with a unit that would be close to you. Most units, when you express an interest in joining them, they will assign a mentor to you to help make sure that you're spending your hard-earned money wisely and not buying something that's from the wrong time period or from the wrong portion of the nation, so that you don't end up with something that was a 1820s fur trade item when you're trying to reenact something from the 1750s. So we treat each other eventually as family. And I know years ago when I started the hobby, there were some people who, because of the time they had spent in learning what they had learned and doing what they had done, they were rather snobbish, and you would come up to them and, well, I'm interested in this. How do I get into the hobby? And they'd tell you, well, go do the research, then come back.
Yeah.
And that's a big turnoff. People who are interested in this want to get out there and shoot those blanks and have fun in the battles and things like that. So as reenactors, we've got to start sharing our enthusiasm for the hobby and attempting to recruit younger people, because let's face it, the people who were out on the frontier as soldiers, as militia, as rangers, were not 60-year-old retired people. They were kids as young as 14, 15 years old up to into their 20s. And you know, we try to accurately portray things, but it's not very realistic when every member of your unit is eligible for Social Security and you're trying to portray people who were active in their teens and early 20s. So that's about all I have to say regarding that.
Dennis, how do I learn blacksmithing? I mean, I don't go to the local Take 101 blacksmithing. How do you learn?
Right.
Better? Okay.
There you go.
There's Brasstown, North Carolina has a class called the Campbell School of Crafts, and Farmington, Pennsylvania has Touchstone Studios, and you can go down there and learn. I took advanced blacksmithing down there. The instructors are great. The classes do have a considerable cost to them because your board and room and everything's included in that price. But wow, you rub elbows. We also go to conventions. There's one in Winchester, Virginia called Spring Fling. It's just outside of the town of Winchester, and they have classes you can take, and you get to study under the tutelage of some of the finest smiths in North America. And the biggest one we go to, other than ABANA, that's American Artist Blacksmiths Association, which this year was in Richmond, Virginia. You can go there, once again, take classes. But one I recommend to a lot of beginners is go to SOFA, Southern Ohio Forge and Anvil. It's in Troy, Ohio. It has a one-money ticket to it, and they have vendors to buy your food, or you can cook your own. And there are endless classes that you can take, whether you're studying the art, and they have hands-on, and as well as experts get up and talk about how they get into, whether it's making Damascus or doing furniture or structural stuff. It's amazing. So again, they have a price tag attached, but if you're that serious and that focused, all that stuff's well readily and available to you. And the books have exploded. There used to be only 2 books available. One was a guy by the name of Alex Beeler. Beeler wrote The Art of Blacksmithing, and he was a traveling salesman that recognized that blacksmithing in the 1960s was starting to quickly fade out, and those that participated were dying off. When I started, everybody said, go see old Riley or go see this guy. And I'd go to see these people, and I'd talk to their widow. And all they had was equipment for sale, and the old fellow would be gone. And so I was getting desperate, and I finally found Beeler's book in a library at Clarion University. And then the other one was Practical Projects by Ted Tucker, who teaches at MIT. And he taught 8th grade kids how the blacksmith. And that was another good, excellent. It starts off with some of the most simplest projects and takes you clear up to them making axes. And one third book that I'm trying to think of was by Adrian Watson, and it's called The Village Blacksmith. It talks about how they did it, what they did, why they did it, and it's wonderfully illustrated. But at that time now, I would say conservatively, there's probably roughly 120 to maybe 200 books readily available, mostly through on the web. Even old Amazon's got a whole load of them for sale. So those are things I recommend that you can lay hands on. And there's a few of us amateurs out there, and some guys that smith professionally, a lot of knife makers. And of course, Forged in Fire is on TV, and wow, I get more questions you can shake a stick at about that. But the partner of mine, Richard Sanguini's a knife maker. Say? Oh, social skills. Yeah, that's a good. Oh, guilds. Yeah, I forgot. Holy smoke, there's a Guild of the Potomac. Thank you. And Abana, and then we belong to, I joined Oil Valley Blacksmiths. They're in Titusville. And Abana, I may aforementioned Abana, and there's one more out there. Oh, Paba, down in Pittsburgh. So it's good to have brains in the back there. And anyways, yeah, that's Pittsburgh Artist Blacksmith Association. And they meet all over the place at different shops around the Pittsburgh area. And what I like about and every one of them, they're willing to share where you can get tools. A lot of guys tailgate, and they'll sell. Unfortunately, I have a bad addiction to anvils. I have over 80 anvils. And people come to me, hey, can I get an anvil? Once in a while, I'll let one, out of the cage and let them have it. But and there's always something for sale and something to goof up. And then you can learn how to make your own tools if you want to. So all those things are readily available out there. Of course, there's always a little price tag attached to it, but you can't beat the fun.
Okay, Jim, you're the best dressed here. So as they've alluded to, or as Greg alluded to, it costs a little bit of money to get into it. So let's talk a little bit about how you get a uniform, where you get it, ballpark price on what it would cost you to kind of get into on the basic thing, and then if you want to go to the extremes, what you're going to end up paying.
Well, the first caveat is nothing's cheap. So to find a good seamstress, that's is one of the things you want to find. And like I said, I'm dressed as 60th Royal American, which was a British group that was mostly recruits from America, but they had some foreign conscripts from Germany, and so there was also some foreign troops mixed in there. But yeah, there's what we call sutlers. We have a couple of them here. They sell equipment that a reenactor would need, but a lot of this stuff are kind of specialty items to the persona you're trying to portray. So you have to do some research there and find a group that'll steer you in the right direction for getting all the right equipment and that. And well, for example, my gun here, this is a rifle shop gun. All the basic parts were about $1,000, and then I had a friend that assembled it for me. Cost me another additional $600, so $1,600 for the gun. The vest I'm wearing, I think $250. The breeches, a couple $100. The shoes about $100 with the buckles. Yeah, like I said, when you start adding the stuff up, it of course, if you take care of the equipment, it'll last a long time, but it's the initial investment and getting into the hobby that costs money. But once you get everything, you have the opportunity to go to places like Old Fort Niagara and get to stay in the period buildings and free lodging. So it's like taking a vacation. You don't have to pay for your motel or hotel room, and a lot of times they'll feed you at the events. And so if you like historic sites, and it's a good thing to get into. But what were some of the other questions?
Am I on? There we go. Not only do you have those, but you also have your camp. You've got your tent. You have all the materials that go with that to feed yourself and your rolls. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the tent and the poles and everything, there's probably, I don't know, $400 or $500 there. There's people that specialize in tents. Panther Primitive, that's their main specialty, making tents. And I actually had my tent made at Conneautville Canvas. It's an Amish-owned business. He makes tents there and awnings and that. But my particular tent, yeah, I paid $400 for it, but it's 20 years old now and it's still holding up and hasn't leaked yet. So, I mean, I imagine it'll last another 20 years, but, besides the tonnage.
Other than that, I was going to say now, the events and stuff that you go to, all right, then what kind of a schedule do you travel with your organization? Do you go to some on your own? How do you guys do that?
Normally you belong to a group and then the group has a schedule for the year, and so you have a set schedule and they'll register you for the event. And some of the events we do are Fort Ligonier, Old Fort Niagara, Fort Ticonderoga, a lot of historic sites. So, and then go there usually for the weekend and come in on a Friday and leave on a Sunday afternoon or evening and head on home. So a lot of the public seem to think that, you know, reenactments are a full-time job and that's all we do is reenactments, but, you know, most people have regular jobs and regular lives, and this is just a hobby they do on their own free time because they all have a love of history, and so that's why they do it.
Okay.
Talking about the reenactments, we do go a lot of different places. In particular, our Marine Deconcert Corps, I mean, you can find a lot of these on the internet. Tinsmithing, you can find tinsnips.org on the internet. There's a lot of books on tinsmithing. The accoutrements that you come up with. A lot of times your unit, like our unit, our Marine Deconcert Corps, we buy a bolt of cloth. And we have a seamstress, a friend, you know, one of the guys in the group that their wives or whatever are seamstress, and they make clothes for us. Okay, so everybody has it, and you can do it less, you know, at a lower cost. Your Charleville, it runs anywhere from a used one, $600 to $1,500. So it depends on, you know, what you're after. And then you have to get your gorgets, and you have to get all your other accoutrements, like Jim has setting here. But the education for any of these entities, you can find friends. Like I go out and I'm constantly looking for another apprentice. I talk to kids and I said, you know, I'll apprentice to you if you're, especially local kids. I teach tinsmithing classes. I'm sure Dennis does. You teach classes also to try to get the greater interest there also with the kids. Okay, so there's a lot of ways, but it is a little expensive to get into, but it's the love of it is why you do it. Okay, the history of it. Okay, it's why I do it. Okay, so you want to add anything?
Yeah, I guess.
Oh, come on, you can.
I mean, we're talking about rather expensive items here, but there are people who are leaving the hobby due to health and different things, and a lot of times there are some very good quality used items out there. I'm particularly good at scrounging those kind of materials because I'm tight enough that my shoes squeak. And prime example, this is a quilled knife sheath and a hand-forged knife that I obtained from a friend who was getting out of the hobby. An item like this may cost you $1,000 or more to have it made. I lucked out. He sold it to me for $300, and I've been carrying it for over 10 years. Now, an item like this that is made out of quills, when I go out in the field to do one of these mock battles, I do not take this expensive item with me. I don't want to lose this $300 knife sheath out in the woods and have to be crawling around on my hands and knees for 3 or 4 hours looking for it. Same way with the bag. If you were to have somebody finger weave this strap and then do the quill work on this bag, you're probably looking at $1,000 or more to have that made. And again, I lucked out. I picked it up for around $300. So things are, the basic kit to get started can be relatively inexpensive, especially if you're doing a portrayal of just a colonial frontiersman or a militiaman versus doing an actual uniformed soldier. But as you get into the hobby and you start to see the accoutrements that are available and what's out there and what they actually use, then you can get a lot of money invested in this hobby. I'm gun crazy. I started out this hobby, I had one flintlock. I now own 30-some, and I constantly see young people coming into the hobby and their parents investing a large sum in a custom-made or a brand new firearm. And again, as I said, our biggest enemy is learning about cars and the opposite sex. We start losing our young kids as soon as they figure that out. And I said, time again, I see parents shelling out $1,000 or so for a gun for a child to start the hobby, and a year later the kid decides he doesn't want to do it anymore. So I started carrying less expensive guns that are fairly close period correct, but you don't have that initial $1,000 investment in a firearm to start the project. And you can find guns similarly priced by going to sites like gunbroker.com, Guns America, go to your local gun shows, check out your local gun shops. But by all means, gain some knowledge about what guns were available during the time period that you want to represent. The guns sold by Traditions and CVA and those manufacturers generally are guns that are from a later period than the French and Indian War. They are more post-Revolutionary War, the golden age of muzzleloading. The earlier guns had a very wide butt plate, anywhere from 1.5 to 3 inches wide. The locks and things were much simpler. But by reading up on firearms, going to various gun shows, going to antique arms shows, you can learn about which are more appropriate, and then you can sometimes fall into a fantastic bargain picking up items that are used that others no longer need, or that someone inherited and they have no idea what the value is. They just want to get rid of the thing, and you can pick up some really nice items for great prices. Or if you're skilled, you can learn to make a lot of these things on your own. I have no desire to swallow porcupine quills by accident. I have no desire to put them in my mouth after they've been colored yellow by using urine. And I don't want to put them in between my teeth and crush them flat and learn how to sew them. So I'm not going to do quill work. I've attempted to make my own moccasins and things over the years. To me, that I'm wasting my money buying the leather, turning out a very inferior product. So I depend heavily on sutlers and picking up used items that other reenactors no longer use. And it's a very economical way. It may take you longer to get the kit together, but it's a very economical way to do it instead of spending a big lump of money at one time.
Good. Any questions? We'll take some questions. Anybody here got a concern they did a good job to tell you what they did? Okay. Well, we want to... somebody's yelling at me. Okay.
After the meeting, I have a table across the street. You can repeat this.
Okay. Table across the street.
With everything that a militiaman or a frontiersman would need to protect the frontier.
Okay, what all the items that a frontierman or a militiaman would need to protect, and they're right over there on the table, so you can see. They're over there. So good. on behalf of myself and the Cochranton community, we want to thank you for coming and spending the weekend with us. And I know many of you, this is not your first time, and you've thought enough about us that you came back again, which was surprising in itself. But we enjoy having you here. We're hoping that you will continue to come back with us and continue to tell your story so we can share that story with the next generation. Big round of applause for these people. All right, we had all guys up there. And I do know we have some young ladies, but tell me how you got involved and what your role is.
Okay, I started several years ago, and basically my first reenactment was the 250-year anniversary of the Battle of Kittanning, and I portrayed a Native American, basically either a female that was captured and adopted into the tribe, or the other favorite story I have was a red-headed French fur trapper passed through. And then afterwards, my brother got into it basically full time, and then I kind of dropped out because of school and stuff. I had other interests. Then several years later, toward the end of high school, my dad fell in with my brother. He started going, and then my brother kind of tapered off. So then I just started after my dad. Did a couple years as just a female, and I only did 2 or 3 reenactments a year, but then I ended up being the only female in camp. It's not so much fun. So then I just started dressing as a boy. And my shirt and my pants, my dad actually sewed by hand, so we only had to buy the fabric and the buttons. And then I spent the next like 5, 6 years mostly as a boy, and this year I started dressing up as a female more, so this is my first reenactment or weekend where I'm actually dressed as a boy for this year. Any questions or?
Bring Dad up here, and we're going to talk about boats. Part of our deal, of course, with some of you who were here yesterday, was we actually put them on French Creek, and we take them up to Shaw's Landing, which is about 2.5 or about 3 or 4 miles, and they come back down, and magically they appear over the rapids, and they become a big part of it. So we're not only having the opportunity to have some, period type stuff, we actually have the guy that built them. So talk a little bit about your bateaus and how you got involved with that.
Well, technically they're pirogues rather than bateau. There's a certain structural difference. The bateau was generally bigger. The profile was different. The pirogues have been more or less referred to as a 3-board boat, flat bottom and two straight sides, and the bow and stern were more or less about 45-degree angle. Mine aren't what you'd call historically accurate. I'm not really that fond of whipsawing out white pine boards without any knots. I cheat and use plywood. But for what I figure that for the average reenactor, it doesn't want to spend several thousand for something that's accurate. You can get one of the pros like I build, throw it in the water 1 or 2 weekends, and he's not out that much financially. They're a nice boat to use. They can tend to be, depending on how wide they are, they can be a little bit squirrely. I made one that was about 24 inches wide, and it was definitely squirrely. But the person that got it, he and a friend went fishing in it, and they had, it was interesting because I had the sides about 11 inches high, and I had a total of about 400 pounds in it. So they had to be pretty careful. I've widened them out since then and increased the height of the sides. I'm dressed like a Eastern woodland, more or less. So many reenactments you go to, you have 1 or 2 natives and 50 Brits. And it's sort of a disparagement there. And the same goes with 50 Brits and 1 or 2 Frenchmen. So I'm not averse to portraying a generic Eastern woodland, and I have been known to don the red stocking cap and play French Melisse. There's not that much difference, and the costume is, by the time you buy 2 1/4 yards of cotton for a shirt, you're about 14 bucks or so. I mean, you can order a shirt and pay $65. If you have handy for a needle, you can really save the money. Are there any questions? Nobody throwing rocks? Thank you very much for listening.
Just as we were trying to get everybody, I found a Highlander. Being an Edinburgh man, we can't let the Highlander away until we talk about it. So here we go.
Hello. My name is Morgan Kuberry. I'm from Titusville, but now I live in Massachusetts, so I'm just here for the weekend. Yeah, I portray a Highlander of the 42nd Highland Regiment, and this is very much a late war impression. When they got here at the beginning of the war, the 42nd wore a great kilt, like you see in movies like Rob Roy and things like that, and a laced jacket, so you knew which regiment was which and all this stuff. And everybody was issued a broadsword and a pistol and these traditional Scottish weapons in addition to a musket. That was how they began the 7 Years' War. They ended the 7 Years' War at Pontiac's Rebellion. They were at Bushy Run and things like that. But by then, they'd tramped all up and down North America, fought in the Caribbean theater. And so by late war, the uniform looked very different. They're wearing what we call red clothes, which is you have a red jacket so your friend doesn't shoot you by mistake, but there's no unit designations of any kind on it, because that would be very expensive to ship across the Atlantic. All the lace and the facings, anything you sent from Europe cost a lot of money. And that's just going to wear out in the bush, so they didn't do it. Because the French and Indian War was a war predominantly of companies, not regiments. So it didn't matter what regiment you were in, and you weren't going to get confused. So a really simple red jacket. The traditional Argyle kilt hose you always see, the diced hose, those got replaced with Indian leggings. And they were ordered to adopt moccasins. So a lot of the companies were wearing moccasins instead of the traditional Benjamin Franklin buckle shoe things you sort of associate with this period. They still had those uniforms. They just kept them in regimental storage, only wore them for guard duty and parade and things like that. This is what they were wearing at Bushy Run or something like that. Would be much more similar to this. The Scottish broadsword was replaced by orders with a tomahawk, because they had to do a lot of things like cutting roads and making fortified camps and things like that. And a tomahawk has 101 construction uses and survival uses, and a sword doesn't. It only has one use. And a tomahawk can still do that thing too. So they switched out the broadswords for tomahawks. They're wearing a kilt while the Prescription Act is in place. It was illegal to wear kilts, but they had them as part of the uniform with the King's Red Coat and Indian moccasins. So it's a very interesting hybrid of basically three cultures of Native American and Highland Scottish and Lowland British. Which was really very different cultures. Most of the members of the 42nd couldn't speak English. They only spoke Gaelic. So that sometimes was an issue. They tended to get along very well with the native scouts and people like that. The Highlanders and the natives tended to get along very well because they had a certain antipathy towards some of the higher command, and they had certain cultural differences that they actually got along and saw eye to eye on certain things very well. To the point that they would intentionally billet them together so that, because sometimes sometimes your traditional regiments and the Indian allies wouldn't get along, but the Highlanders tended to, so they would usually billet them together and things like that. So that's sort of what I'm representing and what I'm doing. If anybody has any specific questions, I can make up monstrous lies in response to them. Does anybody have any questions or concerns, comments? Yeah?
Highlanders were on the side of the British then?
Yes. Most people don't know. I don't know how familiar you are with Scottish history and Highlands and things like that, but there was Highlanders on the sides of the British Army at Culloden. There was Highlanders in the British Army starting from 1739 basically onward. There was at least one Highland regiment in the British Army, which was the 42nd. They were the first one. There'd been Highlanders in the British Army for some time. Because they did so well fighting in France on the continent before the 7 Years' War broke out, and then with their action at Ticonderoga and things like that, some of the success they had in North America, the 42nd did so well that the British Army then decided to raise more Highland regiments and raised the 77th and 78th and sent them over here. So there are actually 3 regiments of Highlanders fighting in North America in the 7 Years' War. And it's because of the success that those 3 regiments had in the French and Indian War that we think of the kilt as the Scottish national, you know, anytime you see a cartoon character, if they want to make them Scottish, they put a kilt on them and things like that, is because of the French and Indian War and the fame that those regiments got. Prior to that, back home, nobody would have been seen in a kilt, you know, nobody with any means or anything, but that's sort of what changed that and changed the Scottish national identity to the Highlander and things like that. So, yeah. So for the Edinburgh connection, that's important, yeah. All right, I guess that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay.